This is the story of two landmark Supreme Court cases that came out of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The Heart of Atlanta Motel v. United States and Katzenbach v. McClung became two of the most important cases in the history of the United States. They became such important cases because of three simple elements: timing, politics, and precedence. Before we can talk about these two cases, however, we must look back into the throes of history to really appreciate how successful the rulings of these cases are. Many events were occurring around these two cases, and some were even relevant from almost 100 years before. Flashback: mid-1800s America, the Reconstruction era following the Civil War. The purpose of this era was to rebuild America in the aftermath of the American Civil War. It was meant to suppress the Southern Confederacy and finally end slavery while promoting positive race relations. Out of this era came a few pieces of extremely important legislation. Those are the Jim Crow laws and black codes in the South and the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Charles Sumner, the mastermind, and President Grant worked to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1875 on the basis of the 14th Amendment because it would force the southern states mainly to stop segregation. However, in 1883, 5 cases were tried citing civil rights, and they would come to be known as the Civil Rights Cases of 1883. As a result of these cases, the 1875 Act was deemed unconstitutional by a mostly Southern conservative Supreme Court, ruling that the 14th Amendment did not give the federal government the power to regulate how private businesses operated. This first attempt of the United States government to promote desegregation failed miserably. However, it would not be the last time legislation like this would arise. Flash forward, 1963. President Kennedy introduces a bill to Congress that is extremely similar to the bill passed in 1875. The Civil Rights Act was initially thrown out and forgotten about because the Southern congressmen engaged in a filibuster. Although influential leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. supported and spoke in high favor of the movement, Congress would not be swayed. It was not until President Kennedy's assassination in November 1963 when the now President Lyndon B. Johnson pushed the bill through Congress. The executive branch was ready to pass it, the Supreme Court was ready to support it, but there were two roadblocks that presented themselves in Congress: Bill McCulloch and Senator Everett Dirksen. In order to break the filibuster, the Democrats had to promise the Republicans in Congress 3 things: that the Senate would not amend any future bills passed by the House of Representatives, and that only McCulloch could approve changes; that the credit for any civil rights bills would be split equally between the two parties, and an amendment to the bill evoking the 10th Amendment.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then. He wins his dignity now. 5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions. Divisions which have lasted all too long. Its purpose is national, not regional. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice.
Atlanta, Georgia, 1964, the Heart of Atlanta Motel. On many occasions, the owner of the motel refused service to African Americans looking for shelter, whether they were traveling in-state or from out of state. In the case, the prosecution cited the Commerce Clause in the U.S. Constitution as their argument, while the defense argued the federal government did not have the right to regulate private business, even if it was interstate commerce. This case was obviously a clear win for the U.S. because the motel was in direct violation of Title II of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, since the motel had advertisements all across the country, making interstate travelers a significant part of their target market. At this time, the court had not yet ruled on a case in private business, citing that these practices did not violate the Equal Protection Clause in the 14th Amendment in the Constitution. On December 14, 1964, the Supreme Court ruled that the motel's practices were illegal, and it became a win for the United States government. The Heart of Atlanta case was important, but Katzenbach v. McClung really solidified the precedence in the U.S. government's political agenda. And now we move to Birmingham, Alabama, summer 1964. Ollie's Barbecue is an obscure family-owned restaurant with an all-white dining room and all-black service. One thing that set this establishment apart from other segregated places is that African Americans could still purchase takeout, they just weren't allowed to sit in the actual dining room. In the first case against McClung and Ollie's, the defense won the case in the Alabama state courts with a ruling that stated the establishment's practices were legal and fair because the government could not regulate how private business operates, similar to the decision in the civil rights cases of 1883. In comes Attorney General Nick Katzenbach to save the day. Katzenbach took the case to the U.S. Supreme Court, where it was tried with the utmost urgency. He did not want to make the same mistake that the U.S. did in the 1880s, so he did not cite the 14th Amendment as his argument. The prosecution discovered that almost half of the food that Ollie's purchased and served came from interstate commerce, and he therefore cited Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2 of the Constitution, otherwise known as the Commerce Clause, just as it had been cited in the Heart of Atlanta case. The defense maintained that it only served local customers, and therefore it had no significant impact on interstate commerce. However, the court had an agenda that it needed to fulfill, and this was to be the case that would establish the precedent for the future, even though probably in any other era it would not have gone so far. To demonstrate how quickly the court wanted to establish the decision, just look at the timeline. The opening arguments began on October 5, 1964, and soon enough, the decision was handed down on December 14, 1964, which is uncommonly quick for such a high-profile and important case. The political agenda of the Supreme Court and the federal government at that time was to finally put to rest the issue of race in the law. They succeeded in the unanimous ruling in favor of Katzenbach. If the right president, congressmen, and Supreme Court justices had not been in place when they were in 1964, these two cases would never have made it past the state courts, or may not have even been tried at all. The more liberal government in place in the mid-1960s propelled the 1964 Civil Rights Act to succeed, where the more conservative regime in the 1880s caused the American Civil Rights Movement to become stagnant. The 1875 Act failed because it could not be properly enforced, and so the court in 1964 worked tirelessly to make sure history did not repeat itself. These businesses needed to be made an example of in order to create the precedent and case law that the Supreme Court needed to try future cases involving segregation in private businesses. All in all, Heart of Atlanta versus United States and Katzenbach versus McClung were among the most influential and important cases to be tried in the civil rights era of the 20th century.